natural attrition's way down. And I think people are more conscious than probably ever have before when they're employed that they're lucky to have the job as opposed to the company's lucky to have me sort of mentality. And so I do think that's exacerbating things. But I do think the companies that are succeeding took the time during the growth period to do the rotationals, to do the cross training, to do upskilling. And so I think what you're seeing is a lot of companies who should have been doing that best practice when they had the headcount and the room to do it. You're going to start seeing narrowing productivity, worsening job satisfaction, a lot more absenteeism, which is going to be a very significant problem. And just a lot of issues come up because they chose not to do that. So trying to do it while you have a bad economy, less people, is a flawed approach that's going to, in your point, end in burnout. But I do think that what I'm seeing a lot of recruiters, or at least talent acquisition departments, be a lot more conscious about it, or a few different things that, again, should have been doing this already.
Hi, I'm Denise Chaffin, and I am your podcast host for Talking TA. And our discussion today is centered around the current state of recruiting and what we can expect for 2026 as we head in that direction. And we want our audience to have some clarity on the direction our industry is heading and can anticipate and look forward to next year. Positive angles to consider, my friend. So let's jump in. My guest is Matt Charney. He is the principal analyst, industry and markets for Kyle and Company, as well as editor in chief for a number of different publications. So, Matt, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself, and then we can jump right in.
Yeah, so I thank you very much for the intro and thank you for having me. And so I also am working with ERE as a special editor. And then I am executive editor and managing Media Bistro, and then under that, recruiting classes and recruiting certifications. So I am lucky enough to be able to work as both a publisher and an analyst and get my geek on in terms of analyzing this recruiting industry.
I want to ask you before we jump in, what I know that you had worked early on in the industry as a recruiter. So, what headed you in this direction? Because this could be actually something that may interest other people as well.
So I'm going to age myself here, but this was the last terrible recession, was 2008, right? 2009, I think. So I was a full cycle recruiter at Disney, and I was handling all the corporate functions recruiting for the CFO, who's now the head of theme parks. So good for you, Tom. So that was my hiring manager, and obviously Disney did what every company was doing at the time, which was laying people off. So my recruiting job for about 6 months became turn in your mouse hat badge and do that. And then it came to me, and I was let go, and I had a really hard time finding a recruiting job because those weren't, as we're seeing now, not a great market, not a great time to be a recruiter. In fact, I'd gotten a job offer, almost moved to Minneapolis, and then like they called me when I'd packed up all my stuff. They're like, "Yeah, our client actually just cut the recruiting gigs." So it was like one of those. We're like, okay. So I wrote an essay, actually in ERE, one of the publications I'm managing now, my first ever blog post, and it was called "How Recruiters Read Resumes." And this was like, again, 2009, but it went about as viral as you could have then. And it was essentially like every recruiter reads a resume, the 2.4 second statistic. It's like, do I know this company? Blah, blah, blah. And so as a result, I got a call from Monster, and they wanted to fly me to Boston to interview me about some new roles they were opening. And I actually thought it'd be funny. I'm like, let me go interview for job board. I was like, this will be great. And I ended up taking it, and I've been doing the marketing side ever since, but explicitly focused on talent acquisition leadership. So Monster, Cornerstone On Demand, Smart Recruiters, and Allegis have been my primary employers on that side.
That is so great. I mean, I think it gives hope to a lot of us. I mean, there's other opportunities out there beyond recruiting. What caught my eye, and the reason I had contacted you, Matt, was because of the article that you had posted and written, I don't know, a few weeks ago called Spin Cycle: How Recessions Reshape Talent Acquisition Strategies. And when I read that article, and if any of our listeners have not read it, it's a good article because you actually have some really great data in here. Because I think that it does highlight some of the caution and cautionary directions that we need to be looking at here. Are we in a recession or are we in a reset?
Well, from an economics perspective, we don't know if we're in a recession because the government shut down. So a recession is technically 2 quarters of negative growth. And since we don't know how last quarter went until we start getting that data, who knows? My a priori kind of guess is that that will end up being the case once we see that data. But I do want to caution that nobody knows because we're not getting BLS numbers, we're not getting Fed numbers, we're not getting like accurate job numbers really. So it's very hard to tell. But we've been in a reset, I think, really for the last 1.5 to 2 years with this introduction of AI into the conversation. I won't say into the profession necessarily, but this whole existential crisis of man versus machine, will robots take our jobs? And to what extent is it going to change the talent acquisition process? That's a reset that has been going on and I think will continue. The difference in conversation now with the recession versus a reset is that people are looking at AI now more as a culprit for job loss than they are an enabler for job creation. So it's a little bit of a different shift.
I agree. There was somebody who had responded to your article, a guy by the name of Richard Skellett, and he made a comment. He said that GDP growth will no longer mean job growth, which I think is an interesting comment. He said it which skews data analytics due to the AI and digital revolution. So let's dive into that a bit.
Yeah. So to me, there's only one recruiting metric historically that has really sort of hit across the board because, like anytime you hear somebody who's either not in an industry, not recruiting for your specialty or function, you're kind of like, okay, that doesn't apply to me. And so cost for hire, sort of like every one of those metrics varies across industries, locations, data. So if you want to normalize, in my experience, the one statistic that is a true north in recruiting is in terms of like quality is revenue per employee. And if you think about why, the less hires you make and the more money you make, the better job of bringing in the right people you are. So every employee is bringing in more revenue. It generally tends to be a better reflection of quality of hire than, let's say, a performance review, which is backward looking. So in that way, I actually think that if that is a metric and a framework we're looking at, recruiting is starting to actually improve significantly because as these productivity tools roll out, we are seeing revenue per employee increase. And one could assume then that is a reflection of quality of hire. Although I agree that those are highly correlated. Causation we'll see, but it does look like it holds. So
So, talking about recruiting efficiency and hiring efficiency, and I'm glad you brought that up because you also have using a section of your Shark Attack article in boom times, every hiring delay is a catastrophe. In a recession, it's a strategy, and I loved that statement.
So, I mean, it's quite simple. In a market where things are up, you're making a lot of hires and there's a lot of forward momentum and growth. So you have a lot more ability to screw up and have a regrettable hire because the headcount's going to be there again. The budget's going to be there and likely the candidates are going to be there too. What you see is sort of the shift in employer branding really kind of reflects this, which is in boom times, employer brands are designed to try to position your company as an employer of choice. And so you get a lot of verbiage and a lot of things about culture and really trying to create some talent attraction and preference in a candidate who applies. What you're seeing now, and this is again the case last time, employer branding in a downturn again shifts from talent attraction to being more PR and investor relations sort of focused. So it's not a great look for companies who are trying to show positive growth. If an investor, for example, goes onto a career page and there are no jobs listed. But again, using a lot of employer brand techniques, you can sort of go around that. So I think what I'm trying to say is that companies, from a strategic standpoint, it's about the optics of growth without the growth of headcount. And therefore, a bad hire reflects much worse on your organization and on your recruiting efficacy than it would when you're doing it wrong.
And because when you are doing it at volume, you're not as focused maybe on some of those aspects like you were talking about, the efficiency piece of it, because we're like trying to get the hires, we're trying to make our numbers and meet our goals, and the goals are higher and the ramps are higher and you're busy, and so yeah, there's things that get overlooked, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I do think like the process moves a lot faster, which is a good thing. Is it if from an efficiency standpoint, though, does it lead to you getting the right candidate hired? I would argue no. And so I think what you're seeing is companies being much more cautious about like pulling the trigger. And that turns out to generally lead to decent outcomes because you're being much more careful in your consideration. And oftentimes there's not that pressure of, I have to make an offer, I have some questions, but my competitor is going to snag them because it's so hot, they're going to go across the street. So I think that always is a fear, right? Like they're going to kick a counter. And once you eliminate that fear and can focus a little bit more on fit, a little bit more on like the candidate's like long-term skills, ability, and all that sort of thing, then you're really getting into better hiring, more efficient talent management, if not necessarily more efficient.
So, going back to your story, when you had transitioned from the recruiting aspect into another part of talent acquisition, looking at the business in general, just based on what you're saying right now, taking the word recruiting out of the mix and just putting back in talent acquisition because it's a broader term, covers a lot more positions, a lot more opportunities.
I disagree a little bit because to me, talent acquisition's funny because not every recruiting job is looking for talent. I think we use that as a commodity. If I'm hiring a low skill, high turnover job, there's no talent involved, right? So, but I do understand the distinction, and yeah, it's an interesting one. So sorry to cut you off.
No, 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 that's fine. That's fine. No, the reason I bring it up is because I think that the recruiters in our business right now are so worried. There's a lot of people out looking currently. One of the other conversations I've had recently is on the fringe industries that people really start need to start focusing on instead of being too have too much tunnel vision towards tech or healthcare or in fact I think it was in your article you talked about the Bureau of Labor Statistics and mentioning some of the roles that are being hired currently and some of the ramps that are happening right now for government. I think it was healthcare, right? And education.
Yeah, healthcare, education, and also there's a huge demand for hourly. There
It
was that
is.
pandemic distinction between essential and non-essential workers, which is to say the essential workers are the ones who are kind of underpaid and in the front lines. That's really where you're seeing the growth of headcount right now. And I think that really sort of reflects the type of jobs that AI can't do, which is sit in the store and do customer service.
Because hiring is so slow right now, and people are, like you mentioned a while ago, are becoming more thoughtful about, the type of employees that they bring on. Not only that, have you heard the term, is it called employer hugging or employee hugging? Have you heard that term yet?
Yeah, are you referring to the concept of like I want to leave my job, but I don't want to go find another one?
And also, I think it refers to employers trying to keep their current employees and give them more work and give them more say, okay, we're going to train you in these other areas, but what's going to happen though, because we're not hiring in these particular other areas yet, because we're being cautious about budget. So we're gonna have you do both. We're gonna have you maybe do a rotational kind of job here part-time, but you're gonna still maintain your other position, which gives them an opportunity to learn new skills and expand into other areas like what we're talking about. However, it's putting a huge demand on people's time because now they're working a lot more hours. They're having burnout because these companies aren't bringing in new people yet. So tell me what you're hearing about that.
Yeah, so I think that that is definitely an issue that we're seeing become more acute, particularly in the United States, which is people natural attrition's way down. And I think people are more conscious than probably ever have before when they're employed that they're lucky to have the job as opposed to the company's lucky to have me sort of mentality. And so I do think that's exacerbating things. But I do think the companies that are succeeding, to your point right now, and at least from a revenue perspective, if not from a headcount growth perspective, took the time during the growth period to do the rotationals, to do the cross training, to do upskilling. And so I think what you're seeing is a lot of companies who should have been doing that best practice when they had the headcount and the room to do it. Really, again, you're going to start seeing narrowing productivity, worsening job satisfaction, a lot more absenteeism, which is going to be a very significant problem. And just a lot of issues come up because they chose not to do that. So trying to do it while you have a bad economy, less people is a flawed approach that's going to, in your point, end in burnout. But I do think that what I'm seeing a lot of recruiters or at least talent acquisition departments be a lot more conscious about it, or a few different things that again should have been doing this already, but I like it. One of the and a lot of those is business alignment. So when we're just filling jobs, our interactions with hiring managers or stakeholders is job oriented in terms of the role that we're trying to fill, as opposed to getting to know the function, getting to know the people, and getting to know kind of all those areas a little bit better. So I know that there's a little bit more alignment that people are doing the thoughtful way with the line to try to both better recruit and then also be able to sort of anticipate needs in the eventuality that hiring picks back up. The other really important thing is that it builds stronger relationships and more trust with your employee population. And so if employees see recruiters out there, whether or not there's a bunch of jobs posted, that's sending a really strong signal out to your company that like we still have recruiters, they're still working, they're still here for us. And so if nothing else, I think from an optics perspective, you're seeing companies that are very deliberate in starting sort of the line alignment and also some career and skills coaching. Because the one thing recruiters are great at is we have the expertise that everyone in the company wants, which is how do I get a better job at this company, right? Or how do I get an opportunity? And so I think that what you're also seeing is recruiters really starting to align to, I won't say it like, well, upskilling L&D, but more, how do I get to know my employee population? What do they want to do? And how can I start mapping that in the case that I do start seeing some attrition or have to cycle people through other jobs? So,
I'm glad you bring that up, and it makes so much sense. I remember one recruiter who was working for one of the semiconductor companies, and they were getting ready to slow down. This goes back to year 2008, 2009, and they were getting ready to slim down their recruitment population, and so she started working with their software marketing team. And she had been supporting them anyway, but as the kind of scuttlebutt was getting out amongst the employees, she thought, maybe I should look at something else. And so she started because like you said, there was already trust with her anyway as the recruiter. So when she introduced the idea of a rotational program and teaching her about software marketing, they brought her in, and she switched over to the marketing side of the business. Another person I knew that had been in talent acquisition was supporting IT. And so IT brought her in and gave her some training and whatnot. She started working in the IT department. Here was the cool part about that one. She was a bank and she was actually working as in IT. I think she was just doing like help desk stuff, some kind of initial IT work.
more than I could do as a recruiter. Yeah.
Yeah, right? But here's what was cool is they still used her for recruiting because now she had skills in both areas. So she was still doing the recruiting for their team because they didn't do a whole lot of hiring for IT at
All
the
right.
time. So it was
So,
kind of cool. Yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
And I was just going to say, I think that companies, when they are looking at recruiters, this has always been the case, but certainly with an eye to flat headcount or cuts, they're very easy to see as interchangeable. The reason why is because we're not aligned. So the more that you can do to pick up other business line skill sets, or at least get visibility and create like competitive differentiation from your colleagues. The perception is it's easy to fill jobs, which we all know is not true. But that's what hiring managers think. It's like writing. Everyone thinks they can write. Few people can. But ultimately, if you are able to build relationships and trust and advocates, the line is going to help you. And the worst case scenario is that person becomes a way better recruiter because she's on the job. And you certainly see that in corporate functions. The best recruiters are always ones who's actually done it before and who understand more. So I love hearing that's a thing. I do hope that accelerates, and I'd encourage people, even if that's not a formal thing that's being presented to you, um, looking at the different skill sets you have and how you can flex those is probably not a terrible idea anyway.
Right. Well, and I can recall when I worked for On Semiconductor years ago, we worked with their marketing team, we worked with their design teams at the time for their products. And we had monthly meetings to where we talked about with the marketing team about competitive intelligence. So we were all, I mean, basically integrated with each other because what we had to do, and we actually had, I think, a nice little seat, cozy seat at the table with not only the HR business partner. I don't know what they were called back then. They're now called HR business partners. So we were actually the talent business partner to that business, along with the product team and also the marketing team, because it took all of us working together to develop strategy, like you were talking about a while ago, to understand who the competitors were that we were going to go after for some of the talent that we needed at the time. We always made the comment about who's the weak link on the chain right now. Companies that might be going through acquisitions or maybe downsizing, or had just gone through bankruptcy. You never know, right? And so having all that competitive intelligence helped us on the talent acquisition side to be able to know who to target then for some of the roles that we had. And it was really super helpful. And I think that it sounds like people are going to get back there again. I don't know why we strayed from there unless it was the fact that we divided talent acquisition between sourcing and recruiting. So now you have this whole separate department doing sourcing. And I want to jump into that too about the bots for sourcing. But if we're going to bring those people back to the recruiting realm, are we going to go back then to being part of the bigger group of people with an organization? Even if you're working as an agency, coming in and working with those different teams as well to be able to help them, even as a third party agent or recruiter or talent acquisition practitioner, whatever you want to go by. Are we going to be going back there and kind of taking a 360 look at our own roles compared to what we did 10, 15 years?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I love that you mentioned competitive intelligence because that's one of the most missed things, I think, by recruiters. And I wouldn't even say it's job related competitive intelligence, although it's always a good idea to do market mapping and figure out compensation and other things, as well as just kind of which companies to target. This is also an ideal time to do that because chances are you've got a lot more of those ex employees who wouldn't have considered you wanting to have an interview. And I'm not saying like set up an informational, but they will tell you any competitive intelligence stuff that you probably want. But what is also fascinating, I think that like just recruiters sleep on these. Nobody reads job descriptions is the common prevailing sentiment. And that might be true, but recruiters should, for the reason that their competition always posts the most business sensitive or forward looking information publicly in a job description. So if I'm going public and I start seeing a competitor's SEC reporting analysts pop up, then that's a good data point that I probably want to share with my team. So the more opportunities you have to inform the business as a market expert, you should do that. And jobs are one of the best litmuses, other than obviously like earnings, out there to do that. Now, as far as you talk about just like team alignment or agency alignment, I absolutely think that, to your point, sourcing does not have a ton of value anymore. It's not hard to find people's information online, and since every point solution sort of is using the same data sources now, it's largely just LinkedIn data, People Data Labs, which is a third party data aggregator, and then generally a job board database that they're synced up with, in addition to their ATS. everyone has access to the same candidates. So who cares? It's about being able to engage and convert those candidates, which is something that, again, AI really is not able to solve for. So I think that you talked about like talent advising. I think from a sourcing perspective, the mindset has to shift from sourcing, building this pipeline. Like nobody really needs a pipeline at any event because it's all just in time hiring. It's great to have an active database, but you can do that regardless of conditions. And I think I would definitely encourage people to do that. But how do you make these people who are getting calls from all these recruiters out there? How do you build a relationship with them that's job and company agnostic? Is really important because as you build a career in recruiting, you're not at your last employer. But the fun thing is that when you're good, candidates come with you. And I think that needs to be the focus now is how do you stand out and delivering value to those candidates? And then also to the client side, being able to advise not only this is a candidate who fits the job criteria, but going beyond that and say, I know this person. Here's why I think they're a good fit for your team and being able to speak to those points, that makes it much easier not only to make hires when roles happen, but companies can create headcount. And you can sometimes make a pretty compelling point if you're bringing in the right person at the right time, where the hiring manager just can't say no, and they have the ability to force the issue. So I think that definitely the focus on sourcing is the focus on AI is a little commoditized. If you can get a candidate to respond to you as a person, then you have done something that is not only a lost art, but the ultimate competitive advantage. So candidate development, not sourcing, and to your point, talent advising, not research.
Yeah, that's true. Very true. So do you think that the bots will win for sourcing?
I mean, yes, to the extent that they already have. I don't ever think that we've had a sourcing problem, and it's bothered me that recruiting has been so regressive about it. To be honest with you, in terms of thinking that sourcing is anything special, the fact that we're still building Boolean strings 15 years after Google stopped supporting those as a necessary thing, kind of silly. But beyond that, people's information is out there. And of course, if you can aggregate that in mass via bot, it's going to be way easier than having to do it manually. So yes, they've already won. And the real question again is most companies have this issue where they have a huge surplus of candidates that they do nothing with who didn't get the job who have applied at some time. So for me, the thing that bots really aren't doing a great job of, but I would consider a core sourcing activity, is taking all the silver medalists, all keep your database who at some point express interest in reactivating them. That's something that I think AI can augment, but it has to be recruiter led for obvious reasons. So I think that's really where the value of sourcing comes in. But at the same time, as an independent function, I haven't understood why it exists for the last 10 years. So, AI is not.
Well, it started existing when the job boards came along. All of a sudden, they divided our position. They said, okay, we're just going to have people because it saved them money. So you're going to be the front end recruiter. You're going to be like the account manager, if you would, right, for this business group. And then we're going to bring in John Doe or Lisa Smith, and we're going to have them as your sourcer. And they're just going to sit in front of the computer all day and roll out resumes and identify candidates. And
I definitely sat in that job and I wish I could have it again. I just don't think that honestly, like are the days of my work responsibility to find 100 people on the internet, like wish I could go back, but I do think that those days are largely over, sadly.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think too that one positive aspect of the AI bots that I've heard recently, and I'll give him a shout out as Trent Cotton made a point in bringing up the fact that bots at some point will be part of the talent acquisition process for helping the employees to identify internal positions for themselves. And there'll be some sort of like a waterfall down to the employee saying, hey, these positions just were posted and you're a great fit for it. You might want to consider. Now, how that's going to work externally, I don't know. I think it's a great add on. And I think that people will really enjoy working with their AI bots from that perspective. But on the outside of it, I think that's still going to take some time to churn and burn and understand where the benefits outweigh the what people think are the job eliminators, if you would, right?
Sure, and I agree with Fred to an extent. But here's the thing that I actually have always found interesting, where there's a bit of a disconnect, is we spend like 90% of our effort like sourcing externally, and maybe 10% like internally. And it's normally harder for a person to apply who's a current employee than an external person, which has always struck me as very silly. So I think that has to start with a mindset change of, instead of wasting my time posting a job, reinventing the wheel every single time, how do I focus really on internal mobility? And if I can't fill the job internally, how do I do it through a targeted referral program? Because right there, you have about 88% of all job fills happen between those two mechanisms, right? And so I think that's really where AI is going to stand out. Not as much on the internal mobility side, I don't think, but referrals, I think, are going to become the predominant source of hire, because you can do network mapping and automated introductions and things of that nature very easily now. So I think I see companies really ramping up there.
So do you see network mapping as a new position for talent acquisition?
Well, it should have always been. I see it as probably falling the talent intelligence bucket. So
Okay.
being able to essentially show networks of influence within a company, and knowing like flight risks, and being able to figure out who needs augmentation, all that sort of thing. Internal skills mapping and internal just influence mapping. I think that's really where things are going.
Well, and a couple of position titles that have come up when I have done some my own research. One of them was talent intelligence partner, turning like labor data, market insights, like what we're talking about right now, and some skill trends into recruiting strategy.
That's the absolute next frontier. We talk a lot about artificial intelligence. It's talent intelligence that really is going to matter for talent acquisition. When we talk about AI and you talk about bots, and I assume you mean like agentic sort of stuff,
Right, right,
like,
right.
that's recruitment process automation. This is nothing new. Conexa and Brasser used to have the capability to stack ranked resumes against job descriptions in 2006, 2007. So this is not new on that side. What is new is our access to the sort of business specific data that helps inform bottom line and bigger picture results, which is something that we've always talked about but never been able to do, is have that business alignment. But if you can go in with that intelligence stuff. So again, what does the supply and demand look like in this market? Where should I be hiring from? What are the major employers that we should be looking at? Where are the skills gaps? And these, again, AI makes them very discoverable, because you're able to look at, uh, visualize huge reams of data that you would otherwise have to like manually put in a spreadsheet and standardize. That to me is going to be the next frontier. And I think that you're already seeing that in really progressive companies, is how do I not only make hires and influence hires, but how do I influence business outcomes through these hires? That's the gap that's missing, that we are now able to solve.
So what do you hear then in that realm for business titles or for talent acquisition titles?
Yeah, so you'll often see somebody who is like, recruitment operations is a pretty common one, that there's a
I
lot of
like
overlap
that.
there.
Mhm. Mhm.
Talent, well, I say the talent intelligence is a title that I'm seeing increasingly, and then people analytics generally tends to be synonymous with talent intelligence, and then workforce planning also tends to have a little overlap.
Yep. Yeah, and then also there's recruiting enablement is like a big yeah, for building workflows and doing some training and automation that helps recruiters, right? Operate smarter and these are all human oriented roles, by the way. These are not AI roles. Okay, so that's one of the things I want our audience to be able to take away from this is the fact these roles require human emotion, human intelligence, human decision making. These are not AI repetitive tasks or things that can go to agentic AI. Another one that I've heard is also candidate experience lead. So let's talk about the candidate experience for a moment.
So, and I say this as somebody who was on the talent board for many years, and I worked on the candidate experience reports, and really the data never showed as compelling an argument for candidate experience as I would like. Nobody, even if you think it back to traditional days, you're not really necessarily paying attention to jobs you're applying for. If you're an average candidate, like, damn it, I didn't get a call back from this company. I'm boycotting them. Like, it wasn't that big of an issue. Instead, what happened is you had a bunch of systems that were more or less obsolete. You still have a lot of them. Take 20 minutes to apply, pull up your resume, then re-enter each field 8 times. That's a UI UX issue. Now we sort of fixed that. And so I think what we saw our candidate experience being like, how do I get through the process and stay notified? We've way solved that. And now we're actually need to engineer the opposite sort of thing, which is we can now have a frictionless recruiting process where you're never going to talk to a human. You're going to get instant feedback and applying's one click. But then at the same time, there's no sweat equity being put in there. So any sort of psychology of reciprocity is going to have diminishing returns. And on top of that, we're hearing, oh, I have too many candidates and too many applicants, which I think is a silly problem. But here's what I would say. Companies do have too many applicants. You never have enough candidates. I would encourage people to make that distinction much more. Because when we talk about candidate experience, or we talk about, oh, I so many candidates coming in AI. No, you have too many applicants. Candidates are people who would conceivably meet your job criteria and be hired by you at some point. And so every candidate should still have a great white glove experience because it's a small market generally if you're recruiting for most professional positions, and there aren't that many qualified people. So making that distinction is, I think, really important. Applicant experience has never mattered. AI is kind of taking care of a lot of those pain points, as have just next gen vendors. And candidate experience is what we refer to as candidate development, which is building relationships on a non-scale.
Well, and that's one of the things too. As recruiters, we've all told our candidates for a long time you need to, or even when we're doing business coaching or career coaching with candidates, to reach out directly to the potential hiring teams or whoever the job poster is and make those direct connections. And people didn't complain about not having responses as much as they do now. But to your point, they're not getting the responses because so many people are reaching out on top of applying for the positions that they're interested in. Now the people on the other end are getting inundated as well. And so there's not as much of a reply. I'm trying to reach out to candidates and let them know I will contact you if there is interest. Okay. If you don't hear from me, just know that the company did not request an interview yet or at this point in time. But I do have your information. I did receive your information just to let them know I have the resume. I have their application for the position. Another thing too that I've done is I've looked through the resumes because I still look through all the resumes because you never know, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's people who write really crappy resumes, and I still want to make sure that I'm hitting the right markers. One of the messages I'm sending out now to people is your skills did not match. And sometimes I'll have multiple people with the same exact issue. Your skills did not match the requirements for this role. Our client is looking for XYZ skills. I do not see it on your resume. And I've even marked out if in fact you do have these skills and they're not on your resume, please feel free to reach out to me through LinkedIn. And once in a while, I might get a response, but most of the time I don't. And so they can't say that I didn't give them feedback because I did provide feedback. So I am still trying as much as possible to provide some in-depth feedback when I'm sending out rejection or no interest responses to people.
And that's great because I think that's what people need the most, honestly. It's not thanks, but no thanks. And it's not that you're not right. Maybe it's that you're not right now. And here's how you get there.
Yeah. But I am instead of just sending out a blanket, we have your resume and making it really automated. I am trying to do individual notes. And like I said, some of the candidates, like maybe you'll have 5 or 6 candidates who I'll send the same exact note to, but it would be the same feedback because they just don't have those skills, right? But I'm trying to be more of a direct communicator, if you would, versus just an automated message.
Yeah, and to the earlier thing I said, those candidates will follow you around to different jobs that you're representing because you're the one who's taking the time to provide value. as opposed to transactional. And that's why you're worth the money.
Moving into 2026. So you've got a nice crystal ball because you're doing so much writing and you're working with so many different organizations and so many different publications. What would you what kind of positive message would you give to our community, the talent acquisition community, with respect to the job market for next year, what they might anticipate, look forward to, and what they should target their skills towards?
Yeah, so here's the fact of the matter. It's not going to be great over the next year for talent acquisition jobs if I look at sort of momentum. However, the talent acquisition market is inevitably going to roll back once companies sort of realize that they've overinvested in technology and underinvested in headcount. And you're seeing already pretty bad adoption lagging curve. So companies are buying AI, but it's not being adopted. And you are seeing even the first gen tools, a lot of churn because the products aren't delivering as promised just when out and outcomes. So the market's going to sway back. And what I would just encourage people who have built a career in this is to not go out of it so quickly. Pick up dimensional skills. I think you mentioned marketing is a great one. Certainly competitive intelligence, and then just business fundamentals. That's something a lot of recruiters like have trouble reading P&Ls or annual reports and that sort of thing. I think just becoming more business literate. But if you're an experienced recruiter who's able to be multidimensional and walk in with a Rolodex, I know that's an outdated term, but a network full of people who can call for positions, you're always going to have utility in some sort of arrangement, whether that's as an executive recruiter or whether that's internal. But again, the floodgates are going to open in a great way once everything stabilizes and once the AI hype sort of dims down and the reality sets in. And so I would just encourage people like AI is not going to take your job. If anything, it's going to be providing a pretty good short term use case into why you need a job.
Yeah, I think so. Some of the other terms that I've heard that people can look forward to that are human centric or human first, they called them human first roles, were employee experience designer. Have you heard this one? Uses, yeah, design thinking to craft engine engaging human centric employee journeys across onboarding, learning, and growth.
Again, why has that job not existed before?
Right.
One would think that's a high impact, but yeah, I'm glad. Again, people come around. There's still a way, so that's great.
People's strategy part, and this is on the HR side. Some of the human first roles are going to be people strategy partner, skills architect. I like that one. You talked about it. You spoke about it earlier. Maps transferable skills for the future, and so they're calling this one a skills architect. Have you heard that one had with other titles?
Not as a title, as a feature of technology, but I love that that's being sort of humanly run, if indeed that's the case, because I do think that like organizations don't know what skills they have, which is why we have really bad hiring outcomes. Because again, we might have that ability, but who knows? Because our systems aren't integrated, we have no insight into what we got. So I think that there's a huge opportunity to start building up some of those capabilities.
Oh, sure. And we can't rely on AI for this. I mean, we can use AI to bring in some of the data, but for as far as mapping goes, that's still a very human centric role. Another one was workforce ecosystem manager for designing hybrid and blended teams. Have you heard of this one?
Yeah, that goes back to like total talent, which I think is really the approach that's going to win, which is jobs need to get done and work needs to be performed. If you're a contractor, if you're a consultant, whether you're a project hire, I don't think that that's necessarily going to matter as much. So I do think that putting together that right equation of here is the output. Now, what inputs are needed? It's not always going to be a full time hire, and I think that companies are actually really starting to get better about blending in both contingent and full time in order to achieve some of those outcomes.
I like that. Yeah, definitely. And then the other one I forgot here is human sustainability manager for balancing productivity and well-being. I'm seeing more articles and more postings around this, around the whole well-being and the trying to keep away the burnout monsters, right? especially like we were talking about earlier, where people actually have a broader role now because companies don't want to hire and they're scaling back. And so they're giving their current employees a lot more work. And maybe some of it is rotational work so that they can develop those skills, which is great. But here we have now this title of human sustainability manager.
I mean, it sounds like a fancy way of saying wellness to me, the way you explained it, but I genuinely hope that companies will start caring about this in a real way, because I think that it's easy to talk about, "Oh, we want to take care of our employees, mental health and all that." I'm not seeing any actual evidence writ large that that's the case, but I am encouraged to hear that that might be, that companies are actually looking for a solution rather than, if you don't like it, leave.
Well, like you said, though, you have to get to that point, that middle ground, though, where you say, okay, we've been working with these new tools now for so long. How well are they working for us? What do we keep them for? I mean, because we're in an experimental phase with all of this right now. So I think that people need to stay positive because there are a lot of opportunities that are going to come from the AI integration into our entire world. And staying stuck in fear is not going to resolve anything. You have to look beyond what you're reading on all the negative press, and there's so much of it. In fact, I've gotten to a point, honestly, on LinkedIn where I'm not reading a lot of the articles that start off with, "Oh, I was laid off twice last year. I was laid off again." All of that kind of stuff. I have to stay away from it because and I know that people need to vent and they need an outlet, but I don't know that LinkedIn is really the place for it. I'm just my own personal opinion.
No, it's not the place for anything, to be 100% honest with you, unless you like really crappy content and updates from people you don't care about. Here's what I would say with that though, is that there is definitely an availability heuristic when it comes to how bad the job atmosphere is. And so a lot of that comes from the low publicized cuts are very well known companies, or it's media. And media is obviously hyper focused on media jobs. So that industry being probably the worst performing, it's going to look worse when that's the coverage. But if you look at like Amazon's cuts last week, oh my God, this is an economic portent of all the stuff that's going to happen. In order for it to move employment numbers by a 0.5%, Amazon would have to have done 20 of those layoffs. So it's easy to take an outlying event as a signal, but even the biggest events generally are not enough to move the macroeconomic needle. And I don't know that we're going to be seeing that in any way for some time, right? Where you're seeing job cuts to the level of it making a difference.
And people are responding to that exactly the way you just described. Matt, this is great information. Any other advice or any other positive as we're wrapping up here?
Yeah, well, this is less next year, more universal thing. I think that as a recruiter, and we talk about candidate experiences sort of like en masse, but know that you're going to be a candidate again, and it might even happen really soon. So rather than be a gatekeeper, be an enabler, because that's not only going to be job preservation for you, but it's going to be good karma. And I think that's kind of what you need to be spreading out there right now.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you so much. This has been an amazing conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it, and have a great day.
All right, you too. Thank you, Matt.